Tackling the weighty but relevant subject of gun violence with a melody that sounds like it's been sampled from a kid's cereal commercial seems like an irreverent move. But that's precisely what made Foster the People's Pumped Up Kicks one of the most talked about songs of 2011. And while the band seems to have exited the mainstream limelight, Kicks Shoot You in the Face While Bouncing Around on a Pogo Stick, Charm, keeps it firmly on that list of elite songs that lyric enthusiasts are probably reading more into than the text itself warrants. Despite the mild controversy surrounding it, Kicks was seemingly crafted with the noblest of intentions. After the hit single was pulled from a number of radio stations in the aftermath of the Sandy Hook shooting, frontman Mark Foster issued a statement providing some context for the song, one part of which I find particularly interesting. I wrote Pumped Up Kicks when I began to read about the growing trend in teenage mental illness. I wanted to understand the psychology behind it because it was foreign to me. It was terrifying how mental illness among youth had skyrocketed in the last decade. I was scared to see where the pattern was headed if we didn't start changing the way we were bringing up the next generation. This notion of using a song to understand the psychology behind disturbing behaviors that result from mental illness is consistent with Foster's earlier statement that he was trying to get inside the head of an isolated psychotic kid. Taking him at his word, Foster's intentions were to use the medium of song to probe mysteries that baffle storytellers, psychologists, neuroscientists, and policymakers alike. His was an ambitious, if cripplingly intimidating, undertaking. As you may have guessed, I don't have much aesthetic appreciation for Kicks. It just has a breeziness about it that comes across to me as emotionless, but I'm willing to chalk this up to frame of reference. I mean, I cut my musical teeth on heavy metal. If earth, wind, water, fire, lightning, and dragons were suddenly to become taboo, the genre would be rendered about as intelligible as Sesame Street does Cannibal Corpse. Beside the likes of Ronnie James Dio, Foster's wispy moaning just makes him look like he isn't trying hard enough. Yet, despite my clear bias on a sonic level, I was willing to give these lyrics a serious look since the song was critically well received and is truly one of the more conceptually interesting pop songs of the past decade. Though that last statement is kind of like saying you're relieved when the contents of the dirty diaper you're daintily disposing of was not as viscous as you anticipated. I tried my best. I really did. But as I read and reread the lyrics, I found few, if any, insights into the inner workings of mental illness and was not led very far beyond the soundbitey appraisal of, "These lyrics are really dark, but have a happy, catchy melody." As snarky as I can be about how much or how little people read into a given text, I generally assume that if a song's lyrics draw a lot of attention, then there's usually something there worth discussing. And with the sincerest acknowledgement that my aesthetic distaste for Kicks might be blinding me to certain lyrical subtleties, I find myself agreeing with the Chicago Tribune's Steve Johnson when he says, "Foster is no Katy Perry, brazenly exploiting teen sexuality for the sake of controversy, but you can't do In Cold Blood, even a Cliff's Notes version of In Cold Blood, in 2 cryptic verses and 8 repeats of the chorus. There's just not enough information there." You might argue that the tune's cheeriness is a symbol of just how far off the deep end this kid has gone. That would be a more reasonable interpretation, though, if Foster were more in control of his lyrics, if he were not, for instance, switching from third to first person in the few lines he's written, or offering as the only possible bits of explanation for the shootings sneaker envy and the tidbit that daddy works a long day. I do think that Foster could have made better use of those 2 cryptic verses and 8 repeats of the chorus, but we also have to wonder whether the typical verse-chorus bridge structure, or even more progressive forms for that matter, are a suitable sling with which to sink a stone into the forehead of that Goliath that is human subjectivity. If a song were to get all psychological on us, what would that even look like? What would it take to make a musical jaunt through the human psyche's winding corridors fulfilling? These are open questions, of course, and I'm sure there are plenty of songs out there that fit the bill, but I, for one, just can't get over the artful psychological touches of Kicks' most obvious thematic predecessor, Pearl Jam's 1992 hit single, Jeremy. Inspired by the grisly suicide of 16-year-old Jeremy Wade Dale, the song is about a troubled kid whose troubles culminate in the spine-tinglingly understated "Jeremy spoke in class today." Even without knowledge of the song's real-life counterpart, the literal is easily understood, assuming you have a transcript of the lyrics nearby to cut through Eddie Vedder's characteristically mush-mouthed delivery. The speaker never comes out and says that by spoke in class, he means shot himself with a class full of students as audience, but the slightest bit of research into the song's origins, or simply watching the music video, makes it all but impossible not to merge the facts of this all too tragically real event with the fiction that Vedder necessarily employs to flesh out the story he wants to tell. Much of the time, authorial commentary does little to enrich our experience of a particular song, often just confirming in a more prosaic manner what the song itself will say much more poetically if we'd only pay attention to what the text is saying. Not so with Jeremy. In this case, extra textual knowledge of Vedder's inspiration helps us make better, richer sense of the choices his speaker makes. So in a departure from my usual stick to what the text actually says approach, I'll assume, and it is an assumption since the text itself is not so explicit, that what the song's narrator frames as Jeremy's unspeakable speech act is euphemism for what actually occurred at Richardson High School that fateful morning, however fictional the other details might be. But regardless of how Jeremy balances fact with fiction, what does psychology have to do with any of it? What insights can a repeated chorus and a couple of verses really give us into the workings of a disturbed mind? The beauty of Jeremy is that, unlike Kicks, it attempts nothing of the sort, and yet in a very different way remains a satisfyingly psychological experience. It has nothing to say about the mental life of a person somehow compelled toward unthinkable violence, but is instead a coming-to-terms narrative of a character touched by violence and left to contemplate its aftermath. The fun part for us is that the speaker is more descriptive than reflective, with most of the interesting stuff bubbling just beneath the surface. Like a good Hemingway story, the iceberg's jagged tip gives us a sense of the hull-breaching potential of what lies beneath. With a little training in how to read psychoanalytically, we can observe in Jeremy a speaker saddled with unconscious guilt and come to understand how the psychological defenses he has set up to keep this guilt buried in the unconscious structure his narrative and inform the choices he makes throughout the text. Before diving into the song, allow me to clarify a strange bit of jargon that is nevertheless useful when talking about how a text, in this case a song, can even have an unconscious. Obviously, a text doesn't have a mind, and so can't have consciousness in any literal way. So every time I talk about what's unconsciously going on in a text, I feel like I get the same sort of look that I do from friends and relatives when I insist that the eyes of bunny-shaped Easter candy look at me accusingly whenever I go to bite into it. And though a text is always the product of an author's mind, we, as always, must be careful when talking about a mind we don't have access to. And speaking in terms of what happens in the fictional speaker's unconscious doesn't make much sense either, since a fiction, regardless of how effective it is at sucking us into its world, is no more sentient than the text through which we come to know it. So wherever I seem to be attributing consciousness to the text, know that this is simply convenient shorthand for saying that the text is put together in such a way as to invite the reader to speculate about hidden motives and unconscious desires in the same way we would if the words were coming out of the mouth of a friend in need of counsel or a patient seeking therapy. Like other critical lenses, it's a kind of game we play with the text. A game that has us reading through the monocle of the armchair psychologist and paying particular attention to how text and subtext play off of one another in a way that parallels the interplay of consciousness and unconsciousness. With that tricky bit of business cleared up, let's sit back, notepad in hand, and see what Oedipal nightmares await us in the first verse. At home, drawing pictures of mountaintops with him on top, lemon yellow sun, arms raised in a V, And the dead lay in pools of my room below. Daddy didn't give attention, no, to the fact that Mommy didn't care. King Jeremy the wicked ruled his world. Jeremy spoken. In classic show don't tell style, the narrator swiftly establishes the central conflict by focusing in on the song's titular character, at home drawing pictures. The mountaintops, lemon yellow sun, and arms raised in a V, unremarkable as child art projects go, clash violently with the dead in pools of maroon below, instantly cluing us in that Jeremy is the kind of child prodigy whose artistic displays come replete with awkwardly placed refrigerator magnets. Like Kix, the stock character of the inattentive parent makes his obligatory appearance, and the narrator provides Jeremy's artwork with a fitting title before moving on to the chorus. Ordinarily, having a character engage in acts of creativity like the kind seen here gives the audience a window into his psychology. Consider, for example, a cliché often seen in horror movies: how pallid, precocious, tortured schoolchildren tend to come standard with notebooks full of torture porn. Remember, though, that it is the narrator's psychology, not Jeremy's, that concerns us here. And we, as budding psychoanalysts, should make at least one observation at this point. Namely, that this scenario seems entirely imagined by the narrator, not only by Eddie Vedder, which is blindingly obvious, but by the fictional speaker within the song's narrative. Evidence from other parts of the song, as we'll confirm in verse 2, suggests that the narrator is not some omniscient force outside of the story, but a flesh and blood character grounded within it. And since there's nothing to suggest that the narrator has a close enough relationship with Jeremy to know what he does at home or how dysfunctional that home might be, we have to assume either that the narrator has a habit of peeping creepily into the domestic habitats of introverted children, or that this inside look into Jeremy's home life is something that the narrator has constructed in an attempt to make sense of the big event in the chorus. Consciously, the narrator is doing little more than giving us an establishing shot. But unconsciously, he seems to be displacing blame for Jeremy's tragic decision onto parents he's unlikely to know anything about, and on Jeremy's own plausible but ultimately imagined proclivity toward the macabre. This displacement of blame makes more psychological sense when we consider the gravity of what is implied in the chorus. Jeremy spoke in class today. Jeremy spoke in class today. Taken literally, the content contained in these 5 words hardly seems chorus-worthy. But by allowing awareness of the text's real-world inspiration to furnish some much-needed context, we are immediately struck by the contrast between the event itself and the words used to describe it. The ambiguity serves an aesthetic purpose for sure, as Jeremy blew his brains out today, while mercilessly committed to the literal and perfectly in keeping with the meter, is more than a little on the nose. But a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, and a shy kid finally breaking his silence in a class of giggly adolescents are on opposite poles of the seriousness spectrum. To the music critic, this is an appropriately subtle artistic choice for any band not trying to be Sesame Corpse. But to our inner Freud, this is a conspicuous instance of avoidance. To describe Jeremy's act more literally is to force the narrator to confront the gory details of what actually happened, so he understandably retreats into vagueness and euphemism. Why not, when it is within our power, render the bloody contents of a crime scene as innocuous as chalk on a blackboard? But this kind of defense mechanism is often suggestive of guilt, and surely the narrator is not to blame for a decision that can only be made in the most solipsistic of solitudes. This is easy enough for us to understand, but as we will see in verse 2, the narrator's unconscious still needs convincing. Clearly I remember picking on the boy, seemed a harmless little punk. Oh, but we unleashed a lion, gnashed his teeth and bit the Reese's lady's breast. How could I forget? And he hit me with a surprise and laughed. My jaw left hurting, dropped wide open, just like the day, oh, like the day I heard Daddy didn't give affection, no, and the boy was something that Mommy wouldn't wear. King Jeremy the wicked ruled his world. Jeremy spoke in class today. Jeremy spoke in class today. Jeremy spoke in class today. From a psychoanalytical perspective, verse 2 is the most crucial part of the song, as it's here where we learn a little more about the relationship between Jeremy and the narrator. Our storyteller is not a floating eyeball relaying information back to some shadowy headquarters in North Korea, but a peer, a classmate, a one-time bully of the song's titular character. In keeping with the rest of the text, the literal details are plainly put in a seemingly improvised style. The narrator recalls a time when he and the other cool kids preyed upon an apparently weak Jeremy, only to be laid low by the lion he helped to unleash. It's a bad memory reflected upon for the same reasons that bad memories often are: to salvage a valuable lesson from the humiliation, to acknowledge and remedy a failure in one's character, and to move on. We might be tempted to conflate this little anecdote with Jeremy's speech act in the chorus, since the old 1-2 is, after all, a powerful and ancient form of expression. But a couple of details in the text prevent us from drawing this conclusion. First, Jeremy spoke in class today, whereas the narrator clearly remembers picking on the boy. You might say, well, he could be recalling an incident that happened earlier that day. And that's a fair point, except for the fact that the breast-biting sock-in-the-jaw fiasco seems to have happened not in class, but at recess. Then we get a little further down, where the narrator tells us that his jaw dropped wide open, like the day he heard, making it clear that even though the two jaw-dropping events are connected in his mind, they are not the same thing. And that poor mangled recess lady notwithstanding, a well-deserved cross to the jaw hardly seems traumatic enough to fuel a song of this much emotional intensity. Speaking psychoanalytically, the narrator's regression into his playground antics of yesteryear is the closest he gets to what's called active reversal, the acknowledgement of repressed emotions and experiences in an attempt to psychologically heal and establish a healthier emotional orientation toward the wound. But the narrator stops just shy of an admission like, yeah, maybe treating Jeremy like a little punk back in the day probably had some adverse effects on his psyche and just might have contributed to his eventual suicide. Instead, the narrator doesn't even complete his sentence, redirecting his guilt back onto Jeremy's unaffectionate father, neglectful and seemingly materialistic mother, and Jeremy's projected wickedness. Translated back into psychobabble, the narrator, in displacing his own guilt over the role he might have played in this tragedy, displaces the possibility for active reversal. As long as he can convince himself that King Jeremy the Wicked ruled his world, that he had complete sovereignty over his own decisions, then the narrator doesn't have to own whatever influence his own wickedness might have held. Whether a genuine causal relationship between the narrator's bullying and Jeremy's suicide can be established hardly matters. The only thing that needs to be real for our story to cohere is the narrator's guilt. And because he has stopped short of consciously acknowledging that guilt, it's no surprise that the rest of the song takes the form it does. Try to forget this, try to forget this, try to erase this, try to erase this from the blackboard. Jeremy spoke in class today. spoken, Jeremy spoken, class today. Jeremy spoken, Jeremy spoken, Jeremy spoken, class today. There's a lot to be said about the bridge, as it's here where the narrator seems to be naming his intentions with the story. Just what is he trying to forget and erase, though? To the intelligent lay reader, it's probably the event itself. It's not clear from the text whether the narrator actually witnessed Jeremy's suicide or whether he just heard about it. But what sane person wouldn't want to erase from his memory the trauma of such an event? And what sane person wouldn't want to erase any guilt that might come along with it? Try to erase this from the blackboard, then, has a nice double meaning. The first and most obvious being the kind of erasing that is best left to forensics, and the second being, you guessed it, the erasure of guilt. The nuances reveal themselves when we take some time to unpack the word blackboard. Despite the fact that this squeaky, powdery abomination doesn't belong within 100 feet of the 21st century classroom, it remains a ready-made symbol of knowledge, lessons, education, etc. So by trying to erase something from the blackboard, the narrator is attempting to negate an apparently painful lesson. This is repression and denial all the way. Psychological defenses like this certainly make reality an easier pill to swallow. But in refusing to ingest the proper dosage, we deny ourselves the full medicinal potency of identifying and articulating our own insecurities and vulnerabilities. After returning one last time to the song's euphemistic chorus, the song descends into almost incantatory repetition and wordlessness. It's hard to put this kind of semi-linguistic riffing into anything but the most subjective terms, but if we simply follow our psychoanalytical reading through to the end, we are likely impressed with a sense of tormented speechlessness, like the narrator is still grappling with guilt he can neither identify nor assimilate. We watch as his words fail him, and he's left, to quote Tennyson, with no language but a cry. Given the weight of the song's themes, this seems a much more appropriate and genuine response to the topic of gun violence than do, 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 do. But perhaps I'm just old-fashioned. So what does a psychoanalytical reading of Jeremy leave on our blackboards? What does such an approach add to a song that's pretty powerful on its own? Well, first off, like any critical lens, it brings us into a deeper appreciation of the text itself, drawing our attention to nuances we might not have noticed otherwise. Pairing a psychoanalytical lens with Jeremy isn't an intellectually partisan move rooted in some tribal impulse to uncover covert racism, sexism, or some other petism or phobia. Jumping too reflexively into a politically oriented reading would deprive an already sophisticated text like Jeremy of much deserved breathing room. If I may borrow a pertinent expression from Tyson, approaching Jeremy psychoanalytically is very much to move with the grain of the text. Compared to most other songs, the verses here are unlyrical in the sense that there's almost no rhyme and very little consistent meter. It's as if they are deliberately designed to seem improvised. To his credit, Vedder manages to produce a largely unembellished monologue that sounds like it's coming straight out of the mouth of someone reclining on a therapist's couch. Speaking more in terms of content, without a way to talk about how guilt informs and structures its narrative, Jeremy is little more than a hastily cobbled together eulogy, like the kind of thing you'd say if you were called on to speak a few words at the funeral of a person you hardly knew. This is, to be fair, still a pretty cool concept for a song, but with a few basic psychoanalytical tools, guilt becomes the engine that drives the narrative, and the song is less about this single tragedy and more about powerlessness and culpability in the face of tragedy as a whole, which is a far cry from the vague solipsism of Pumped Up Kicks. Speaking more in terms of general aesthetics, Jeremy, especially when placed beside Kicks, offers us a lesson in what I'd call artful ambiguity. Even as a reader who makes much of multiple meanings, I believe there's a difference between ambiguity that enriches and sheer word fog. Jeremy's chorus is a clear example of how to do ambiguity right. The song sets up a context in which it is understandable for things to remain unsaid. We're told enough that we have a general picture of what's going on, but not so much that we're denied those short pleasurable leaps from the text's actual words to what those words seem to be implying. And though he is at times the villain of his own tale, the narrator's use of ambiguity as a coping mechanism coaxes a degree of empathy from the reader, and so we can delight in the text's subtlety rather than scratch our heads over its opacity. By contrast, it's hard to find Kicks' narrative compelling when its main hook makes owning spiffy shoes a capital offense. A once fashionable, now goofy brand of footwear just isn't that powerful a symbol, man. And where Kicks had space to really explore the inner darkness of its gun-slinging protagonist, we get lines like, "Your hair's on fire, you must have lost your wits, yeah?" Yes, the person who would say that to his cigarette is as mad as a hatter, but his psychosis isn't presented in such a way that I'm compelled to see him as a victim of forces beyond his control. So he doesn't have the latest and greatest in designer footwear, and his father, though seemingly well-intentioned, isn't around much. Who wouldn't shoot up the school? Sorry, I just can't make that leap. What reason is there to get inside the head of an isolated psychotic kid, if not to elicit a degree of empathy for a person that would otherwise elicit contempt? And I don't mean to bash this song endlessly. In a year where, as in many other years, the three biggest pop song themes were partying, being happy because you're in love, or being pissed because you've been rejected, a song about shooting people while fetishistically focusing in on their choice of shoes must have felt like a breath of fresh air. I realize I haven't exactly made the full case for Kicks' lack of psychological depth, and feel free to correct me if you think I'm being unfair. But as it stands right now, I just think that Kicks is proof that a song can be ambiguous without being deep, and that you should look to Jeremy if you want to see a similar theme handled with about as much psychological nuance as you can fairly expect from a song. Jeremy isn't trying to do more than a song can do, as it comes to an end without its narrator really having exorcised his demons. And those little imps are particularly difficult to shake in his case because of what philosophers call the mind-body problem. Our fundamental inability to access invisible, immaterial consciousness when so much of our knowledge depends on the observation of physical characteristics. And it is perhaps tragedy, most of all, that forces us to acknowledge our own frustrating inability to penetrate the impermeable membrane that separates my consciousness from yours, turning to art, science, and reason in an attempt to understand and harness the mechanisms of the mind. Literary attempts to understand consciousness are as old as our oldest myths. Neuroscience has made impressive strides in understanding the brain as a neurochemical machine, and for well over a century, psychologists have developed compelling and enduring theories to help explain the sophisticated operations of that machine. But a science of neural hardware and mastery over the mental software are not the same thing. And all our current psychological jargon can only go so far in explaining how a kid can be passing notes in class one day and putting a pistol in his mouth the next. That Jeremy's suicide is conceived as an act of speech is highly appropriate, since to speak is often to be misunderstood. By subtly drawing our attention to the ways in which the narrator fails to understand Jeremy's motivations, or his own, the song's residual effect is not so much, "Oh Jeremy, we hardly knew ye," but, "Oh Jeremy, in hardly knowing ye, we are forced to recognize that we hardly know anyone, including ourselves." That is all I have to say, but certainly not all that can be said. What have I oversimplified, overcomplicated, or left out altogether? What other texts use the compact medium of song to reveal profound truths about human psychology? Let me know all I've missed in the comments below, and please be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth song analysis. This is Professor Chase. Hope to see you next lesson.
When there's a lightning, you know it always brings me down. 'Cause it's free and I see that it's me who's lost and never found. I cry